Thanks, Alan, and welcome, everyone. My name is Gladys Brahma. I'm the editorial director here. And welcome to our summit today called Cloud Security and Recovery in 2023 and Beyond, brought to you by the great folks at Rubrik. The editorial staff of RedmondMag.com and Virtualization and Cloud Review have worked really hard to bring together some of the best independent experts on this topic for this event, so we really hope that you enjoy it. Before we start today's event with these 3 great sessions, we do have a couple of announcements. First, this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing, so keep an eye out for an email from us with a replay link. It should be in your inbox in the next couple of days. Second, each of today's 3 sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A, so please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can during the session, and if not, we'll pass them on to our presenters, and they can follow up with you independently. During today's 3rd session, we are giving away a great prize, a Brazil Barista Pro stainless steel espresso maker, but you have to be present to win, so be sure to stay on for the entire event to qualify. And finally, we do have some resources from our sponsor Rubrik that are available on the console right now, so please do download and check those out. It's because of Rubrik underwriting this content that we can bring you this summit. So we thank them for sponsoring the summit and supporting the community. And in return, we ask that you check out those resources so we can bring you more events like this in the future. Now on to the first session of today's summit. This one is called The Current and Future Cloud Security Threat Landscape, being presented by Summit stand workhorse, Ian Thornton Trump. I'm not sure that's the word you would appreciate me calling you by, Ian, but Ian's a frequent presenter here. He's the Chief Information Security Officer for Cyjax Limited in the UK and the Chief Technical Officer of Octopi Managed Services in Canada. Ian is an ITIL certified IT pro with 25 years of experience in IT and IT security. From 1989 to 1992, Ian served with the Canadian Forces Military Intelligence Branch, and in 2002, he joined the Canadian Forces Military Police Reserve until he retired as a public affairs officer in 2013. After a year with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police as a criminal intelligence analyst, Ian worked as a cybersecurity analyst and a consultant for multinational insurance, banking, and regional healthcare verticals. Today, Ian is the Chief Information Security Officer for Cyjax, as I said, and the CTO of Octopi Managed Services, and he has deep experience with the threats facing small, medium, and enterprise businesses. His research and experience have made him a sought-after cybersecurity consultant specializing in building security operations, working as a virtual CISO, and sharing his passion for building effective cyber threat intelligence programs for small, medium, and enterprise organizations. Thanks, Ian, so much for this presentation. Take it away.
All right. Well, I'm going to workhorse this through. Thanks so much. It is absolutely delightful to be here. And let me tell you, it is true. We are busy doing these things because there's so much great information out there. I put up my bio slide, and then in the summertime here in London, a great activity is, of course, to be out on a patio, and you can see I'm enjoying one of my great activities right there. But there's lots of ways to get in touch with me on the socials, right? Through the Beer Farmers, Fat Hobbit, my own Twitter, Cyjax Limited, Octopi Managed Services, and of course Swiss Cross, which is a philanthropic organization that goes into some of the toughest countries in the world to do surgeries, reconstructive surgeries for folks that have been accidentally caught in a crossfire between warring parties. So today is a really interesting day because you cannot talk really in cybersecurity in the month of December without looking and kind of forecasting a little bit in the future. And what's interesting to me is the 2023 assumptions was actually a copy and paste from my 2022 assumptions And I'm just going to say that I kind of got it right. We are seeing the fact that digital transformation in cloud is accelerating, no question about it. There were some weird reports that came out during last year that, cloud is slowing down. Not according to Gartner. We're talking big, big numbers of growth and whatnot. And I've got some ideas around this. Certainly momentum, because it's according to Gartner, 18.8% was the growth forecast for 2022. Now we're looking at a 20.7, so a big, big jump, and just short of 600 billion in 2023, which is the spend. So essentially what we have is a really interesting scenario developing, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the inflationary pressures, which are actually opening up a huge opportunity space in cloud, and I'll explain why in a little bit. But I also want to address the struggle that we're having with the shared responsibility model. There is a big difference between fully hosted and fully managed. And I don't think a lot of organizations, perhaps even Rackspace, suffering the cyber attack that they did on potentially unpatched Microsoft-hosted Exchange boxes, so not Office 365 platform, but the hosted version offered by Rackspace. This caused kind of a lot of bad news for many users of that particular offering. So we are seeing that the shared responsibility model of who patches what, when do they patch, what that kind of attack surface looks like, is still tripping us up a little bit. And there are legitimate security concerns about how the cloud is going to play out in terms of the platform for organizations to build upon. But be aware that one of the things that we run into quite frequently is the fact that simply moving your on-premise infrastructure to the cloud is some sort of fast, quick, and easy digital transformation is not necessarily particularly good for security. So unsurprising is the fact that ENSA, which is the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity, has come out with essentially the threat model of all threat models, which is really quite appropriate, right? So we're talking about, well, why is stuff getting broken into? It's because monetization is at the key by, I would say, the majority of cybercrime groups that are out there. Then you have geopolitics and espionage, geopolitics and disruption by a number of different state-sponsored actors or state-sponsored groups along ideological lines or on the grab of intellectual property that is left not particularly well defended when it's been digitally transformed from on-premise to the cloud, and somebody made some cardinal sins, which we're going to talk about in this particular presentation very shortly. And of course, ideological. As we have come to see, as the war in the Ukraine unfolds, as China takes provocative moves against Japan, cyber attacks are quick to follow in the footsteps of ideological or nation-state activity. So this is just something you could say almost situation no change. So now what we have is a really complex threat model that really has to do with the lack of or abundance of certain things, right? So we have a visibility problem in a lot of cases. We have a bunch of issues around maintaining and building very complex systems with the cloud in hybrid models, et cetera, et cetera. We also have a major issue when it comes to credentials and credential management, which comes as no surprise, as a lot of cyber criminal actors now are conducting attacks not with malware or even malicious links, but just trying to trick you into yielding your credentials to find those systems that may not be protected with single sign-on, or that single sign-on is available but hasn't been enabled, or systems that may have a lack of multi-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication support. So we do have a big credential problem that we'll talk about. One thing I do want to point out here is that in a lot of cases, budgets and project risks to digital transformation are really driving a lot of the, shall we say, poor life cloud choices that have been made, along with ignorance of the capabilities and attack surface of the cloud that can be introduced, which of course leads us right to vulnerabilities that we might have in our cloud infrastructure after we have moved it onto an older hypervisor or an older operating system, which is now exposed to the entire internet. That usually is a very bad day. The other thing, of course, is the cyber criminals. They have adapted to the changing times, and there's some really interesting observations that I'm going to be able to share on how cyber criminals are sort of adapting to this threat model, and we're going to have some takeaways as well at the end of this. So sit down, relax, kick back, get yourself a coffee. Hopefully you've already got it and not going to miss any of this amazing stuff. But let's get into it, shall we? So, yeah, one of the challenges that we really are having these days, and as you can see, I took a still from one of the Predator movies there, is that the lack of awareness in a lot of organizations on what the business critical applications are, what the business is really focused on. Another way to describe this is the crown jewels, and if everyone understands what those crown jewels are, and then again, are those things, those critical things, up to date in the configuration management database? This is really important. From what defenses do we need to deploy to crown jewels that are delivered from cloud infrastructure or even in a hybrid fashion? We need to know what things are doing, and we need to be able to set some priorities around even the basic stuff like one of our sponsors can provide with us, or actually the sponsor, backup of those particular cloud assets. It's not quite as easy as just pushing a new config into the existing production environment. The other issue we have is, are we consuming the right logs, the appropriate logs in our security incident management engine, which obviously is a little typo here on my slide. I do apologize. But the issue here is, are we logging at the application layer? A lot of organizations are really comfortable logging at the network traffic layer and even the Active Directory, because of course Microsoft Sentinel plays a huge role in, or Azure Sentinel plays a huge role in being able to consume telemetry from Active Directory, Intune, and Azure, and a bunch of other type service offerings. But I think where we inevitably end up is really around, are we able to discover the things that could imperil the normal business operations? And I think that's really, really important to kind of have as a takeaway. The other last piece of this is really around the regular backups of that particular system's data. So you can have systems set up where you've got snapshots, but it's really important that when you're using technologies like that, that you're not running those backups within the same instance. And we'll talk a little bit more about that and why third party is such really, in my opinion, a must-have. Also, the level of exposure, right? What other compensating controls have you established in front of it that may be able to protect it should it come under fire by the bad guys? And interestingly enough, a lot of this visibility issues and logging issues and security issues are all easily consumable in the next generation of technologies. And I've got like the NVG here, where you can see how the folks stand out in that kind of infrared capabilities of night vision. But notice that it's ray traced out, that the AI and the machine learning figures out how to kind of like better identify a potential hostile adversary, right? So this is where I think we're going in 2023 and beyond, is really understanding and describing threat actor in terms of the discrete steps that they will take, according to MITRE ATT-CK, about how they will break into systems, move laterally, drop malware payloads, and stuff like that. So I tend to see a lot more of this type of a development, mostly because the amount of information that is coming out of our cloud environments can be overwhelming, and looking for that signal that something is bad through the noise becomes one of the most important challenges for preemptive activity within those particular environments, right? Now, we talked a lot about complexity being sort of our own worst enemy. And, you know, this is very true, especially when we look at hybrid configurations where the front end is perhaps hosted in the cloud, but the back end is still, parts of the back end are made available via like APIs or database offerings, and vice versa. I've seen some organizations that have their front end servers within their own infrastructure, but back end a lot of non-important but equally functional data into, you know, service Azure blobs or service S3 buckets. So again, depending on the type of technologies you've got going and the stuff that you have deployed, at the high end of the scale, architecture and the dev and DevSecOps process are really, really important. But however, it's all of the stuff that falls underneath that, where, you know, as I like to say, the internal technological debt from layer 2, right, to layer 7 becomes a major challenge to the organization in terms of, like, you know, securing the DNS, securing the routing, secure firewalling, managing to make sure that internal DNS is not resolvable to external DNS entry points, right? Load balancing, front-end web server clusters, back-end database clusters, etc. Because all of this stuff is the foundation that you build, you know, the application upon, and it has to be understood, secured, and working properly in order for the rest of that cloud infrastructure to work properly. And then, of course, this pulls out the ability to DRBCP scale and monitor for performance. Now, remember on the 2023 assumptions I talked about, it was just one sort of stuff in italics there. I talked about inflationary pressures creating a push and pull effect for cloud spending, okay? Well, this is exactly what cloud offers that on-premise technology does not, okay? Cloud offers the ability to dynamically scale. So many organizations right now, as we run up to Christmas and the festive season in general, these are high times for online retail shopping, of course. So one of the key decision-making factors for organizations that have such boom and bust, and it's said in a lot of cases that the holiday season is where the majority of sales for some organizations occur at a colossal scale, in that they sell the most stuff during the holiday seasons up until, you know, the Boxing Day sale, and then sales dramatically fall. Well, can you imagine if you have to write a bill for the peak level of performance and scalability, and then not be able to scale down and save the organization money, i.e., you know, you need a giant HP 3-par to handle your online transactions at peak, right, instead of being able to dynamically scale up into the cloud. And because of those inflationary pressures that we're finding, where sales may slow down more dramatically as a result of, you know, talk of a recession or even supply chain challenges or other issues, you're going to not want to have tin standing there doing nothing for you, right? So this is where the architecture piece and the scalability from DevOps and the DevSecOps perspective go all the way down into the deep parts of the business and actually impact at a financial level, right? And what is the single source of truth? That's a really, really good question, because a lot of the times, different silos of the business may have different views on what is mission critical and what is required in terms of the business functionality, which ultimately means you're making something, selling something, mining something, potentially. So in my mind, if you looked at this as sort of an in-order type of top ways to get a grip on your cloud in 2023, it's to really think about how you can start, your war on complexity and perhaps simplify things and reduce the amount of technological debt that has been inherited from maybe not being as judicious as you should when you talked about digital transformation. Maybe it's a chance to do a bit of a do-over, right? Now, this was another issue that came up, and actually it was in my 2021 presentation. It was really about credentials and the problems that we're having in securing credentials for either privileged access or the credentials of our customers, right? So we always have this struggle in IT and IT security, okay? One of the biggest things that we have is we want the onboarding experience on e-commerce and other services that offer an experience, if you will. We want that onboarding to be as simple as possible, okay? And we want it to appeal to as many people as possible. So mandating multi-factor authentication right from the get-go for customers is not necessarily the smoothest way of getting onboarding to occur. Now, it really depends on what level of sensitive information you're going to be collecting from those customers to demand a much higher level of security, or post-onboarding when the person is perhaps doing a demo of the product or looking at the product with very limited use cases. Pushing multi-factor authentication might be appropriate after 30 days of use, or after the first transaction occurs, but you want to make that transaction as seamlessly as possible. Where this has become the kind of rating point, if you will, for cyber threat actors is really around the move from dark web and telegraph groups that are essentially access brokers. They're essentially having cyber criminals gain access to an organization, perhaps even privileged access to an organization, and then selling it to third parties for anything from a ransomware attack or a much more sophisticated attack on intellectual property that might be available because that access that they're selling, an unprotected multi-factor authentication credential for the business itself, not just a customer account that can be exploited, but an actual privileged user account within that organization. So this is a huge problem. I think, to be fair, this is why we saw a dramatic change in the threat actors who are going after credentials a lot more. And honestly, if you could say that we had a victory in 2022, I think we are making it more difficult to get a malicious link through an email system. We're making it far more difficult to get a malicious file attachment through email. So the credential stealing gives a good return on investment without sort of betraying and immediately using a malicious activity in order to gain access to the infrastructure. I'm not saying it's going to go away entirely, and we all see things that slip through the defenses, but it seems like, at least from a Microsoft O365 perspective, I've gotten a lot less malicious links or even attachments now, because you can tune certain things in your email infrastructure to really limit what type of attachments are being allowed through. Generally, in a customer-facing environment, you will not want to be receiving things like .rar attachments at any point, or even .zip might be outlawed except for external use to specifically whitelisted organizations. So there's an awful lot that I think we're doing. I certainly wouldn't declare victory, but it really seems the name of the game now is stealing credentials, gaining privileged access, specifically to cloud applications and certainly to cloud-hosted infrastructure for sure. Now, I put up a very simple slide because this is actually a topic in itself about, top tips for budgeting and managing cloud risk. But the IT and the IT security people and the DevSecOps and the digital teams all have to be aware of these major costs, because if we're not aware of them up front, then we probably aren't going to be able to spend, because remember, the first rule about cloud is everything costs money in the cloud, right? Bandwidth, storage, compute, all of these things cost money. So we need to understand that there are a bunch of costs associated with cloud that we really didn't have when we did on-premises. Okay, so the first are, of course, the costs associated with, as I said, bandwidth, storage, compute, the security solutions that you may have to implement in the cloud that are more tuned to and customized for specific cloud environments. The backup questions, right? Because anything that is in the same tenant as your production environment can quickly become removed should that production environment be compromised, folks. So having your backups in the same tenant is a terrible idea. And then, of course, there's the cost of logging, be it logging to a SIEM or logging in general for compliance and for even, debugging certain functions within the production environment should it need it. And logging, folks, is not only important, but it's also it becomes expensive from a storage perspective. So log management is one of those cloud costs that actually kind of sneak up a little bit. And it also becomes really important from a fiduciary responsibility in terms of like Office 365 environments, where the default data retention for deleted data and deleted user account data can be very, very small, measured in days, if not weeks. So from a legal and compliance perspective, you may have to retain data that was in disabled or Office 365 accounts that are no longer in use, right? You're going to have to figure out how you're going to preserve that information should you need to go back into it. And you can spend a lot of money with Microsoft, or you can build a project or a program that can archive it. And then that can be stored safely away, and if it's ever needed, it can be opened up and searched in an e-discovery capacity, right? So then we have the actual delivery costs of cloud that, if you're not aware of it, if you're in the early stages of digital transformation, this can really curtail the amount of money and resources you have available to do cloud right? And that includes the end user training required, the support team training that's required, audit and compliance demands, project management. If you've never managed a cloud project or digital transformation project, it's a safe bet that things could easily come off the rails. Also, architecture. Architecture is phenomenally important in setting a base layer, like I said earlier, that works and that can deliver the solution. With poor architecture, everything else built on top of it, falls over, right? Like the proverbial house of cards. And then, of course, the actual implementation costs, because one does not just throw stuff into the cloud and go live with it. You really have to test. And I think that is really important. And one of the major takeaways from this is before you go full cloud, you need to test the environment that you're placing this stuff in to deal with the expected unexpected, to get all Donald Rumsfeld on you. Because there's things that will go wrong that were dealt with a long time ago within the organization that now that it's moved into a fresh environment on a fresh hypervisor may not be nearly as predictable or easy to diagnose, right? So as part of the budget and project risk piece, to sort of prevent you from making your own cloud nightmare, right, is the failure to ask the tough questions around the project scope. Okay, now this is for the PMs that are out there. This is for the managers and director levels that are out there. And the two things are obviously about the project proceeding and responsibilities of data and all of that stuff. Let's zoom in right here on the two things in bold. When will the old solution be decommissioned? This is really important, folks, because that old solution can get forgotten about as everybody is migrated to the new and the fancy, and it can be hanging around for years, untouched, unused, but still presenting a risk to the business, right? Because it may have really important sensitive data on it, and it's that secret copy that everybody's forgotten about that could bite you because it may have fallen off the list of, and I've heard it before in organizations, we don't have to patch that. We don't have to update that because it's no longer in production. We've migrated everything to the cloud, right? So the number one question, I think, to reduce risk in the organization and is really to talk about what's the plan to decommission the old, right? And then the other thing that becomes really important is you really can't do cloud without a data retention and data deletion policy involved, because otherwise, every year your cloud costs will astronomically increase if you're not applying some basic data retention and data deletion. Now, this is where you get into the IT war versus legal and compliance, or GRC war, in that some data will need to be retained according to various regulatory requirements. Some data will always need to be retained almost for life. So if you work in the legal profession, wills and trusts is an example that you will need to retain that data. I think it is for the IRS, business records and associated accounting has to be 7 years of data retention. Now, back in the old days, this is where the whole change and approach to risk has to be understood. Back in the old days, we bought platters, we filled those platters, we would just go and buy more platters. And as the cost of storage slowly decreased, we found ourselves in a situation where we can have terabytes of data storage at a ridiculously low price. Not so in the cloud. You pay for everything that you're storing in the cloud. So the key here is operational data should remain close at hand to the operational capabilities in the cloud. As soon as you decide that your data retention policy is going to be infinite in the cloud, your cloud costs will accelerate to the point where it may become unfinancially reasonable to store thousands upon thousands of transaction records. So this is the other thing, that everything starts out really, really great in cloud until you get the bill, and it's usually a giant bill. Now, I put a funny meme up here about it being technically called incompetence. Now, this is the sad state of affairs, that one of the first things that comes up is at scale or with the new technologies, you don't know what you're doing. Human beings never really like, especially IT human beings here, really like saying they don't know how to do that. Because what is the primary thing that the IT team has to do? It has to deliver. You've got to deliver. Delivery. Open the ticket, close the ticket. Open the ticket, close the ticket. So you know exactly what I'm talking about. And so sometimes it's really hard to convince the business that before we go full cloud here and digitally transform to non-SaaS platforms, by the way, and there's a caveat that I'm going to add about that as well. But the problem here is if you're not sure about the cloud technologies and how they work, the worst case is you can spend way more money than you need to, right? The second worst case is you're going to miss something really important that is a big potential data exposure, okay? So in a lot of cases, the intent of what you're doing is tremendous, and the organization will embrace it because they see, potentially, especially if you've architected it correctly, a big decrease in cost, right? But if you're not sure about how these technologies work, if you're not sure about, the various different types of firewalling, security groups versus security access control lists, et cetera, within that particular cloud problem, you've got to get your education down on that particular stuff. And the team, especially IT teams that are very comfortable working in the on-premise environment, virtual networking, virtual management of resources, load balancers, and all cloud-based load balancers, all of these technologies are all new. It's sort of like, if I can give you an analogy, taking a person that's really gifted with Microsoft Exchange on-premise, yeah, and making him or her the Office 365 Exchange guru, and finding that without this skill set and the way things have been changed by Microsoft in the hosted solutions, it's going to be really the struggle bus. And bad things can happen in Office 365 because it's an entirely different platform and it's integrated with OneDrive and SharePoint and a lot of things that can cause a lot of problems, and Teams, of course, as well, right? Which was something that generally Exchange was the email system. Now it's Office 365 is the collaboration, business, and file sharing system. So keep that in mind. Anyone that is working with Office 365 has to have the skill to do it right, right? And I pointed out that the project management office who supports the project managers out there, if they haven't executed a digital transformation project before, it could very well end in tears. I think that's true. And then, of course, software development lifecycle does not include security in the early stages, and that's actually something that we're gonna start talking about very shortly in this, right? So these are sort of the common mistakes that we see that threat actors are so ready to exploit, which is, of course, finding a dev environment that has substantially less security on it than a production environment, or a vulnerability in the dev environment that is protected from a compensating control in the production data environment. So an example might be you've got a CDN covering your production data, and you have a web application firewall in front of your production environment, but the dev environment, because of budgets and everything like that, doesn't have those fancy things, right? So now you're dealing with a substantially degraded dev environment that doesn't have those compensating controls and extra protections. And if you are making the cardinal sin of having production data in a dev environment, well, my friends, that's just as good and just as interesting to a malicious actor than the actual production environment is, yeah? And again, there's a lot of work to do this properly, is secure golden images or pre-application deployment images, including all of the standard configurations that you may need. And then, of course, DRBCP at scale across clouds and across environments even, depending on what the business needs are. And then I just make fun of how difficult it can be when you're dealing with .NET updates, security updates specifically, and Apache updates, such as struts, Tomcat, etc., which allows me to rave about the one thing that didn't happen this last American Thanksgiving, which was we didn't get a CISA alert about a Apache update or a Drupal update that is going to end the entire world. So actually, I think it's been the happiest American Thanksgiving in a really long time, because there wasn't a miserable vulnerability that had to be tracked down over the weekend. So that was a pleasant relief, I think. Now, I mentioned SDLC, our Secure Development Lifecycle, right? Software Development Lifecycle. We really need to take a different approach when we're talking about the cloud, because assume any major mistake will be visited by tons of different threat actors because of the level of exposure it will be found, right? If you're a big brand and you're putting stuff up on the interwebs, you need to be aware that the best way to fix a bug is never in production because it can have super unintended consequences, yeah? And as a story actually way back in the 90s from IBM pointed out, it can be up to 100 times more expensive to fix a bug in production than getting it in the early stages of the software development lifecycle, right? I.e., in dev, not in staging, not in QA, and not in prod. So really, if you can push secure software development lifecycle down into the earliest parts of the application development stack, you're doing really, really well. Threat modeling. How is this application going to be attacked? What are the likely vectors of attack, right? So this is where we talk about the use of filters versus parameterized input, which is what all the kids are doing. We can even talk a little bit about modeling here too, because there are languages out there, modern languages like React and .js that are more, I would say, resistant to putting in dodgy code that might be able to be manipulated, right? Secure coding practices, the SBOM. Everybody found out how important the SBOM was when we started hunting for Log4j vulnerabilities across our estate. Man, it would be sure easier if we had a list of all of those different software components that go into our applications, you know. And I think a lot of people learned an important lesson about how dev should be working and operating in that digitally transformed environment. Continuously trained, of course, on the latest techniques that both an attacker would be using, but also what are some of the techniques that are now considered best practices. You know, this is where we reference things like the OWASP 10, for instance. Automated SAST and DAST testing, third-party library scans, all of this stuff, again, should be pushed down into the earliest stages of development. SAST being the static analysis software testing, and DAST, the dynamic application security testing. Acceptance tests on QA. Again, once again, as it gets up its stack and it gets nearer and nearer to being pushed into production, maybe a sanity check from QA might be the way to go. This is a way of getting all of the security into the applications at the different layers, at different levels within the organization. Pen tests on the QA environment, really, really great idea, because that's, you know, sort of the last step before the application is going to land itself in production, because usually QA is doing their testing in the staging environment. Not always, but that seems to be one of the more important areas. But get them involved, get them a role in security and finding bugs before they get into production. Remediation of vulnerabilities goes without saying. If there's high and critical, it's a terrible idea to push those into production. And again, it's an iterative cycle. Each time something gets by or something's caught or what have you, you can now go back and say, okay, we need to test that. Can we build some scripts? Can we buy a tool that will identify this particular thing before it gets into production and could wreck those, you know, for lack of a better word, sales numbers or customer experience, or inadvertently show customer data to the wrong people. And so we talk a lot now about vulnerability management, and it's sort of interesting because I think we're really advancing the ball on vulnerability management in general. So a couple of major sort of inputs that I've seen in 2023 and above, something I'm calling intelligence-led vulnerability management, right? Or as I like to call it, no longer vulnerability management, but attack surface reduction, okay? Now, the reason why I think we need to reframe the vulnerability question is because of some great free tools that have come out lately, such as CISA's list of exploited vulnerabilities. So vulnerabilities that are under active attack by threat actors, and they publish this and keep it up to date so that you can actually test against these particular type of CVEs, depending if you have those devices or that software deployed, rather than just doing massive scans across the estate and finding, a gazillion medium and low risk things that aren't internally exposed to the organization, that there's tons of compensating layers of control in front of. But again, so for me, it's a critical, kind of like priority response for the organization is when there's a vulnerability that rates high, so let's say over 8, it's exposed to the internet, you have minimal compensating controls in front of it, it's in the hands of a threat actor being actively exploited. That should be a 5-alarm fire. Okay, that's where, DevSecOps or your security team needs to get in front of that particular freight train and do your darndest to not get hit by it. You'd be surprised at how few things actually hit all of those categories. And then you sort of move to the back of house where it might be exposed over your network infrastructure at like a WAN, so it's an internal app only, okay? Well, fair enough. And if it has a critical or high vulnerability, not a bad idea to prioritize patching on it, maybe on a monthly or weekly cycle. But ultimately, I'm going to just go out and say it. If you're in a situation where it's on the local LAN only and it doesn't interact with the internet, you should be looking at your workstation attack surfaces at that point instead of what you have exposed, that is only addressable from a local area network perspective, right? APIs, there's a ton of stuff out there about people not knowing or creating APIs without keeping security in mind, okay? So application program interface, right? The idea here is that modern web pages today are usually a conglomeration of all sorts of data thrown up into a display, right? And in order to essentially show you that content. And again, we go down the list, security on storage buckets, really easy to diagnose and to deal with as well, and all sorts of other stuff that is part of the whole vulnerability stack. Should it be internet addressable, handling, and priority? So, basically when we get down to it, we have cyber criminals that are just as adept and specific groups that are doing what they do with a lot of the tools that I'm about to reveal to you, and primarily, using cloud services for hosting their own infrastructure for attacks, targeting cloud credentials, exploiting misconfigured image containers, targeting cloud instances for crypto mining, and targeting cloud infrastructure, cloud app programming, APIs, and cloud hosted backups, right? That's what they're doing. So these are a lot of the tools that you can use in 2023 at maybe the QA level or even in development or in a DevSecOps role or DevOps to test your infrastructure against the type of tools that are readily available from the organization. Everything from what is your security scorecard, a passive sort of scanning and analysis to outright attacking infrastructure to see how bad things are going to fall apart. Now, I'm running a little bit behind time, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these two next slides because I just put them there to understand that the ideas of attacks on cloud infrastructure is nothing new. They will continue. And when you look at the things that I'm showing you in the yellow, you can see exactly what I'm talking about. Roke leverages a number of remote code execution vulnerabilities in such things as Oracle, WebLogic, Apache Struts, Adobe Cold Fusion. For any of those that are still using Adobe Cold Fusion, oh my God, PHP MyAdmin and Redis, okay? Look at Fancy Bear, widespread distributed and anonymized brute force types of campaigns. You can simulate all these type of attacks with the toolkits of stuff that I just showed you, right? And then, of course, check this out. Team TNT, right? One of the more advanced type of guys, they're after misconfigured and publicly exposed services to the internet that have been not properly secured, like Docker, Kubernetes, and Amazon Web Services. And then, of course, you've got the Chinese mining groups that are looking at taking over your infrastructure to run cryptocurrency mining operations. Please have some sanity and set some maximum account spend controls, right? Work with the accounting department to set a reasonable spend control on your cloud so that when you reach that, you get an alert because these folks will massively scale your infrastructure while you're not looking, like such as being away on a long weekend, and create hundreds of instances and all deploy crypto mining on them if they can pop credentials to your mining or to your hypervisor platform or credentials for your environments. And then, of course, they're also looking to get their stuff, if you will, onto the web application endpoints. So what are the key takeaways, and what are we talking about in 2023? It's really constructing and managing your high-level threat model in your organization. So are you looking then, based on these 4 threat actors that I said, are you able to scan for and look for remote code execution vulnerabilities on that cloud infrastructure? What kind of controls are you putting into, number of failed logins, brute force credential attacks? Are you able to, detect them? Can you fix it? Do you have a CTI program tracking these threat actors against other organizations that may be in your industry vertical? This is critical. And of course, the vulnerability landscape is always changing. We're one tweet away from having a really awful weekend as we try to chase down a newly exposed and weaponized proof of concept that got dropped on Twitter against common infrastructure that we see. And so to me, where we go as a result of where we've been, if you want to talk about the future of security cloud landscape, is really getting DevSecOps and DevOps to start integrating cyber threat intelligence so that you can expect the type of attacks that are going on in the past and the present, and then, of course, in the future. And I do say that if you're scaling your staging and perhaps your dev environments and not using customer data in them, of course, you can really start looking at, your robust encryption between data at rest and in transit, and don't include secrets in your API function calls or certificates within your API function calls, because that's a great way to lose all your data things. And then finally, if you're on the internet today, it's almost criminal to not be using a CDN and a web application firewall in front of it, right? Make sure that you're involving your CTI program and finding the latest threats that might be coming against your infrastructure, against your vulnerability management posture. Multi-factor authentication has to be there for your environments, for the repos, for the signing keys, etc. And the big thing now is integrity monitoring of your infrastructure, right? The vulnerability scanning is one part, but monitoring for integrity is also critical, And then, of course, the storage. We talked a lot about that today in making sure that you're managing your storage buckets, not only from the security, but also from the data retention, because data is risk in this day and age. And then, of course, can't say it enough times, is to obfuscate the data in the dev environment for sure. And then, of course, focus on what is your response to the worst case scenario of DCP testing. And I think with that, we've got about 5 minutes or so to ask me the tough questions on cloud and cloud environments in general and the future. So go ahead.
Thanks, Ian. And by the way, the word I was looking for earlier was mainstay, not workhorse.
That's okay. I think it works hard.
Yeah. All right, so I have a question here from Michael. I have RAID, snapshots, and a NAS device for my backup. Why are you saying I need a cloud-based backup solution too?
So the biggest problem is what's called sort of lateral movement within the environment. So RAID is great, don't get me wrong. So that was, the old school redundant disks in the various configurations, mostly to deal with what happens when a disk breaks. It's far older technology. The big issue there with RAID is, of course, anybody that has had to say the prayer to the firmware gods, when you're updating firmware on the physical devices. A lot of RAID management issues go away with the cloud. And so I would say that this person is likely having on-premise stuff. Now, snapshots tells me that there's a hypervisor involved, because that's usually how you get snapshots going on. So the snapshot issue is a really interesting one because if you're doing snapshots, chances are the storage of those snapshots is local, and I'm seeing that because a NAS device is mentioned. The fact of the matter is if the credentials to the hypervisor are popped and that box is the one that's connecting and pushing the data to the NAS, all you've introduced is one more step for a malicious actor to laterally move into the environment and delete the NAS backups of those snapshots. So the reason why I'm saying is because I've seen threat actors move laterally through an organization, laying waste to it, stealing all the data, and blowing up all the backups that they can reach their hands on. I believe that the API type of relationship from a cloud instance to another cloud instance through a separate set of credentials when managing backups is a more effective way of making sure all of your infrastructure isn't put at risk because, essentially the apples are all in one basket. Yeah?
Perfect. And kind of a good follow-up for that. So on the other side of the coin from MJ, my cloud costs are out of control. What is the best way to try to save money?
Yeah, so this comes down to a lot of things where the organization actually may not need cloud for some things that they're doing. So really understanding what you have, where that data is, and whether or not, again, data retention being the big thing, but also there might be ways of optimizing the infrastructure. One of the things that this tells me is the organization may have been dealing with performance issues by essentially throwing more compute, more memory, and more processing at any sort of performance problem. And this is where you may need to go to the third-party marketplace and buy something that can give you deep insight into how your applications are performing, and maybe even identify that you're doing some things maybe in a recursive manner that really could embrace a more more efficient way of bringing the data that is needed in the quickest possible way. The other big savings that can happen, depending on the transactional nature of your particular website, is to deploy a CDN in front of it. And the reason for this is that the CDN, which generally is used for caching, that is used for caching static data. So you may not need anymore to pay for every single web page component every time somebody lands on your web page. I'll give you an example. MJ, if you log on to a website and you see, the logo Cloud Security and Recovery in 2023 and beyond, that image is a static image. It's going to appear on the website no matter what page you go to. Now, if you don't have a CDN in front of that, every time you go there, chances are there's going to be a transaction to verify that image is in your local cache, and the browser will then use your local cache. However, if you're getting tens of thousands of new visitors because you have a marketing campaign going out there, and that image isn't in the local browser cache, you will be transmitting that local image to every single new visitor that is coming to your website. Now, you might think, well, Ian, it would take thousands and thousands of visitors to do that. At scale, when your static components are being asked for again and again, it costs a lot of money. A CDN will cache that image and offer it to the requesting browser from that cache, and it won't require you to actually even go to that particular cloud. The transaction will actually, that component will be, well, you want to say magically, but in a way it will just go on to that browser without ever going to the back end part of that website.
Great. Thanks so much, Ian. That was a great response, great questions, and a great presentation. Thanks, everyone. We're going to take a... Oh, sorry. Sign off, Ian. Good.
Well, it was my pleasure.
Thanks, Ian. Everyone, stay tuned. We're going to be taking a very, very quick break, and we'll be back for our second session, Top 10 Expert Best Practices for Cloud Security and Recovery. In the meantime, check out those resources provided for you by Rubric on the console, and we'll be right back.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second session of today's summit, Cloud Security and Recovery in 2023 and Beyond, organized by the hardworking folks at Redmond Magazine and Virtualization and Cloud Review, who have brought together some of the best independent experts on today's topic. Many thanks to our sponsor, Rubric, the Zero Trust data management company, for making this event possible. And thanks to you for joining us. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief of the Converge 360 Group of 1105 Media, and I'll be your moderator for this information-packed session. But before we get started, a quick reminder, each of today's sessions is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for that email with a link to that recording. It'll be coming your way within the next few days. This session will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. Actually, I think if I know our speakers, they're going to weave the Q&A right into the presentation. But remember, you can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Please feel free to add them as the questions occur to you throughout the summit. Our speakers will do their very best to get to all of them. Our sponsors provided some extra resources that can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a moment to check those out. And at the end of the summit, you'll be asked to take a short survey. Please take a moment to share your honest opinions. Our editors read every comment. I know, I'm one of them. Your opinions help to shape our future events. And last but not least, at the end of the third session, one lucky attendee will be receiving a Breville Barista Pro stainless steel espresso maker. Oh, God, it's so beautiful. But you must be present to win, so stick with us. Now let's get started with our second session, Top 10 Expert Best Practices for Cloud Security and Recovery. And for this session, we called on Dave and Crystal Kawula. Dave Kawula is the Managing Principal Consultant at Tricon Elite Consulting. He's a Microsoft MVP with more than 20 years of experience in the IT industry. His background includes data communications networks within multi-server environments, and he has led architecture teams for virtualization, System Center, Exchange, Active Directory, and Internet Gateways. Also an MVP, Crystal Kawula is the president of Tricon, where she manages the day-to-day operations of the field consulting and sales teams. Early in her career, she worked as a consultant with Microsoft, authoring content for internal SM, SGR, and GTR teams, which was used to train internal support engineers and global escalation engineering teams, he tried to say. She's the co-founder of MVP Days Community Roadshow and the hashtag MVP Hour live Twitter chat. She is also the only one of only 2 women in the world to receive the Veeam Vanguard Community Excellence Award, and she recently helped publish a book for other women MVPs called Voices from the Data Platform. This is an amazing team up. You guys are in for a great session. Take it away, Dave and Crystal.
Awesome, John and team. Thanks for having us here today. This is quite a special occasion because Crystal and I don't always get to speak together, and this is just a fantastic topic. Crystal, are you excited to be here today?
Very excited. Finally, I pushed John out of the way and I get to come in.
Absolutely. Well, with that, let's get started because, as we move into 2023, Crystal, I think that cybersecurity recovery and best practices have never been more important for organizations, especially in the geopolitical climate and state that we're in right now. We're seeing more and more threats and shots coming across the bow. So we're excited to give you some great content here today. So with that, we're going to go through a top 10 list here today. Just a little bit of housekeeping for everyone. As John mentioned, we love to keep these sessions interactive. So if there's any of these topics that are resonating with you, and you'd like to get a little bit more information, feel free to go in your Q&A panel and ask the questions. We'll try to get to absolutely as many of those as possible. So, Crystal, the very first topic that we'll talk about here is securing our admin tenants.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a very simple question. In today's day and age, do we still have people out there using their organizational daily driver accounts to manage the high-level practices in their organizations?
So
we preach it day in and day out. Don't do it. Do we still have people doing that?
You know what, Crystal? That's a fantastic question. And the answer is yes. We work with a lot of organizations across the world, and you'd be absolutely shocked and horrified to find out how many of them are using that account that's a low-privileged, non-administrator, local admin account to do full global admin tasks inside of their tenants and inside of their M365 environment, which is absolutely horrifying because, that account is not designed to work that way.
Now, we know we have some smaller IT organizations with just one or two people that are working there, and they're trying to manage the whole works of it all. What can they do in order to make sure that they're still able to do everything, but aren't giving away the keys to the kingdom every time they log on, or risking the keys to the kingdom when they log on?
Yeah, it's a really good point, Crystal. And one of the biggest complaints that I get from the smaller IT organizations, we'll call it the one-man bands, or, the jack of all trades that's out there, is that we're creating environments where we want to secure things, but there's just too many accounts and too many passwords. And you know what? In the world that we live in today, Crystal, I think we have to look at something. And it's actually a really good quote that everyone can write down. It's from a good friend of mine, Steve LeBeau. And he said, security was never meant to be a matter of convenience. We need to make sure that we harden and we secure those environments. Now, one of the things that you can do immediately, if you're not aware of this right now, is you can take those low privileged accounts that you've got and give access so that you can log into, for example, your tenants, but don't give them full admin rights. You can elevate on demand. And even better than that, we can sometimes have separate admin accounts inside of there. But if you're not going to have separate admin accounts, privileged identity management is something that is really key. And so how I equate this is that, I often work as a consultant with many organizations. And the very first thing that I ask them to do is please either get rid of my account or disable my account, because I don't want other privileged accounts just hanging out in there. And so in the same thought process with privileged identity management, we want to give just-in-time access for the resources that are required only for a very specific period of time. So that's available inside of your Azure tenant, inside of Azure Active Directory. You just need to enable that, and you need to configure it for the roles and resources that you want to grant access for. Now, the next thing is that, Crystal, we come across a lot of organizations. Those global admin accounts, kind of the number one thing that you should be doing on any type of admin credentials, especially cloud credentials, is multi-factor authentication. So, Crystal, are you seeing the same thing, like with multi-factor being a big piece that organizations are still kind of struggling with?
I think something that we're finding is always resistance to multi-factor. You mean I have to do one more step before I can access my stuff, and then if I walk away for 5 minutes and my machine shuts down or whatever, now I've got to come back and log back in. And with cloud, I think multi-factor is probably the most important, or almost the most important place that you need to be enabling your multi-factor authentication, because the fact is it's accessible from anywhere. You're not necessarily sitting at your desk to get onto it. If you don't enable multi-factor authentication, you're leaving yourself a wide open window security-wise.
Yeah, absolutely, Crystal. And the other piece to that is that, especially in regards to Azure Active Directory, conditional access policies aren't enabled by default. And so with that, one of the first things that happens when you create your very first conditional access policy is it asks you for a break glass account inside of that policy. And so now, what is the break glass account? What do we need this for? Well, one of the things that we can do with conditional access policies is we can do country and IP blocking to make sure that you've got an attestation policy that states, yes, I am who I say that I am, and I'm coming from a known good IP address range. Maybe those are your internal IPs for your company, or you're coming from a known good country. But it is also possible to make a mistake when you configure those policies and potentially lock out all of your users and or your admin account. So that's where the break glass account comes in.
You sound like you're speaking from experience.
Yes, possibly. And so when you look at that break glass account, I had a very interesting conversation with one of my customers about this, and we got onto the topic of break glass accounts. And one of the things that they were mentioning was that is the holy grail of accounts inside of your infrastructure, because that has overrides to the conditional access policy. So country blocks aren't applied there. And they said they actually break that password up in 2 or 3 different components on, separate pieces of paper, separate safes. And I said, whoa, that's probably, one of the most extravagant ways of doing that I've seen.
It reminds me of like when you're in the movies and they have that one briefcase and you have part of the passcode, and somewhere on the other side of the country, someone else has the other side of the passcode. And it's obviously, we don't have that here, but the movies tell me that that's how people access, super secure stuff.
Exactly, the nuclear football. Right on. Okay, into our second topic here. The low-hanging fruit, Crystal. When you go to spin up, and this was actually really funny because it's not actually that hard. And I'm going to ask our attendees, this is where you're going to be sitting at work and you're going to be doing a virtual show of hands here. You're going to be throwing your hand up in your cubicle, and people are like, what are you doing? Like, you're putting your hand up to an audio webinar.
At least we like to imagine that's what you're doing.
Right. And so one of the things that I look at is the fact that when you spin up a brand new tenant, the only thing that you really need is a little bit of light information, a credit card, and you can get access to spin that tenant up. You know how many of those have rolled into production?
Way too many.
Are those things secured by default, Crystal?
Sadly, no.
No, they're unfortunately not secured by default. And so this is one of our big pieces of advice that we have, is that when we look at things, especially like your cloud infrastructure, from the perspective of backing it up and securing it and even the recovery portions of this, is that you have to light up all defenses possible. We call it shields up in our world that we live in. So if you're going to walk into battle and you have the capability of having the best defenses possible, you wouldn't take and you wouldn't arm your soldiers going out into battle with nothing. Just go walk out there. We want to have them having the best defenses possible, right? And so from a cloud perspective, Microsoft calls this Microsoft Defender for Cloud. You do have to enable it. There is a cost to it.
Now, is the cost worth it for these organizations? Like, we do know it is a cost, and everybody's always thinking about, okay, we've got to keep it within our budgets, we've got to do this. What is the cost of having it versus the cost of not enabling Defender for cloud?
Yeah, I kind of look at any modern security features that we can have as almost insurance policies for our organizations now, Crystal. Because, can you afford not to, I guess, is the point. And so how do you know if that infrastructure that you have is suffering from what I call next finish syndrome, where I equate this to building a desktop. You can download an ISO from the internet. You can take and you can build yourself a boot key that will help you build that. It's very easy to do. And within basically 4 nexts and a finish, you have an operating system with whatever password you chose on that device. Does that mean that it's secure? Does that mean that it's hardened? The answer is no, absolutely not. It's built for usability, not for security. And in the same way, the cloud artifacts are kind of set up in a similar way. Now, the providers are getting better by starting to build a more default security posture for a lot of things as we go to build them now. But if your tenant is a few years old, those weren't turned on by default, and they're not just going to come around and necessarily turn them on after the fact. So it's something that you really need to look at in tightening the screws. And this goes for many different types of cloud resources that are out there. It could be your storage accounts. Make sure that you've got encryption at rest. Make sure that you've taken and that you're restricting public endpoint access. Your cloud file shares, Azure files, same thing. Third-party add-ons, firewall services, virtual machines, platform as a service, your containers, Kubernetes, all of that stuff. And so when I look at this and even taking this to the next level, turning on Defender for Cloud is kind of the first step, Crystal. But there's also the advanced buttons that you have inside of there that you can look at. And that's looking at some integration with things like Azure Sentinel, where we can take and we can have a theme integration where we can pull in various sources of logs into one central point where, you can let the cloud, you can let AI do its thing to help you really discover what's going on inside of your infrastructure. And so the big point to this one here is that, no, the security features are not enabled by turn them on. And do I feel that there's value in doing that? I think that it's not that there's value. I think it's a must-have. In 2023, if you go through your tenant, Crystal, and this is not turned on, go get the budget and turn on all available security features at your disposal.
I think one of the barriers is that there's a bit of a misconception that, okay, if I put it in the cloud, well, let's say Microsoft or Amazon or any of those cloud providers, they're going to protect it for me because it's their cloud. And the fact is, they're going to protect their stuff from your stuff, and they're going to put a base level of protection. So yes, you are going to have a little bit of protection, but the fact is you're going to have to go in and configure your environment for your environmental needs. They're not going to it's not their army protecting yours. You got to set up your own defenses.
Well, and along those lines, you can purchase services from the cloud providers and the big security providers to do things like outsource cybersecurity operations center. And so that's something we'll talk a little bit about later, but that's also something that we highly recommend is that, partner with your security providers, with your cloud providers that are out there, because, especially if you're a smaller IT organization, do you run 24 hours a day? As humans, we can't, right? And the bad guys never sleep.
That brings up another question for me. What about app services like websites running on cloud providers? Are all the security and features enabled for those, or is that something you have to go in and configure? And I think actually you have a story about a client that ran into an issue like that.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I was just having a conversation this week with a client, and the marketing department had actually taken over the corporate branding and the corporate website. And they're like, listen, IT, we don't need you for this. We're going to go partner up with cloud provider, and we're going to handle this ourselves. We're going to hire somebody. They're going to look after the front-facing website and image. And IT from the ownership group was told, hands off. Okay, hands off. Sounds good. And so then all of a sudden, 6 months later, the problems start to roll in. The website's slow. It's inaccessible. You might be having some foreign characters showing up on your website. And so as it turns out, when they had purchased this, they didn't even buy anything. They just used the freemium service with the cloud provider, which provided no firewall, which provided no security, which provided no maintenance, which provided nothing, no backups, anything. And so, this goes to say the same thing for your app services. You're going to host app services inside of, your cloud tenant. Make sure that you're purchasing a level of protection inside of there that would be equivalent for you protecting your own physical on-prem infrastructure. If you're going to make investments to protect and harden your IIS infrastructure to run your internal applications, you're going to make that same spend in the cloud. This is not something that we really cut corners on. All right, the next one, cloud resiliency. What do you think about this one, Crystal?
I think it's something that a lot of people don't think about enough when they're moving out to the cloud. Like, people assume the cloud is, because it's everywhere, it's indestructible. It's always available. And honestly, resiliency on the cloud is better, statistically speaking, than on-prem, less outages and everything, but we do get outages. And I think what you need to plan for is whether or not your organization can handle a cloud outage.
Oh, fantastic point, right? Because we're being pushed into a cloud everything model. We do still talk about hybrid. There's lots of organizations, and I come from the hybrid world, so you, Crystal. But there's organizations that have got a really big push to move those app services up to the cloud. And there's a lot of benefits inside of there. I don't need to manage the load balancers anymore. I can get geographical separation through the cloud data centers. It's just there's a lot of things that we don't have availability for in-house. But one of the things you have to plan for in regards to like cloud resiliency, especially if it's a provider outage, is it going to be a regional outage that you're planning for, or is it going to be something at a whole level? And I think what we have to look at is that we normally focus at a regional level. So how do we protect ourselves against that? We use multiple regions inside of there. So if one region goes down, we can fail over to another. We can use global load balancing services to redirect traffic to, the closest home base for all of those app services that are running. But one of the big pieces is that you have to look at coming into 2023 from a kind of backup and recovery perspective for the cloud is, can your organization survive if that happens? If you just took and turned things off, which once again we'll talk about in a little bit here, is that a survivable case? And for whatever reason, we don't know what's going to happen in 2023. We're not psychics, and so we don't know exactly what's going to happen in the future here. And so when we look at putting all of our eggs in one basket in one provider, is that necessarily the best way to go? Does your code base actually support rolling out across multiple platforms? Hopefully it does. Hopefully you've got a universal code base. So if something did go down, you have a recovery mechanism, because if something does go down from a cloud perspective, there's certain things that are out of your control. This is not like where we're used to going and physically being able to touch a server, remove it from the rack. As a hardware failure, okay, we know how to deal with that. Put in some new hardware, lay down the operating system, secure it, join it to the domain, put the workloads back on there, and we're back in business. It's not the same from the cloud provider because you have no control over that. You're at the mercy of, whatever that they can do. They're going to create SLAs inside of those contracts. But for any of us that have been in IT for a long time, the SLAs are there, but the SLAs are not guaranteed. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's the big point here. There is no real guarantee, in the same way that there's no guarantee of, our on-prem infrastructure. And I think we're almost a victim of our own success with the cloud, because a lot of those resources have gone up in the cloud. We haven't suffered a lot of major outages inside of there. And so now the business doesn't understand what outages really mean anymore. So we've almost done our jobs too well, for, a lack of a better way of saying that. So in the event that this does happen, is the business still prepared that, this could happen at some point in time?
We've removed the fear.
Right? And so one of the features that you have that's available to you right now inside of, most of your cloud tenants is the regional replication capabilities. And so if you're talking about same cloud, we can easily replicate those services around to different regions. So if it is a regional outage, at least that part can be covered. The multi-cloud resiliency piece has always been a difficult discussion, and you're talking about like major big app services. For the smaller customers that are out there, the regional single cloud stuff is the world that you're going to live in.
Do you recommend multi-cloud replication?
Possibly. It depends on how big your organization is, though. And so
how critical is data?
Yeah, and so I live in a 24/7 world, Crystal, where I have to deal with customers and their operational support teams. And operationalizing and getting proficient at all of the tasks to manage one cloud is very difficult for an IT team. Doing multiple clouds, that is extremely difficult. So you're talking about a very large team at that point in time, because now we have to really break apart some of those roles inside of there. So that's my bigger concern. It's not the technology, it's the operationalization of the people and the processes that are involved that just lag and they take time to catch up. And so that's the big concern that I have from a multi-cloud perspective. And for our smaller customers, probably single cloud.
For those of you that run and need to be up and running 24/7, 365, that is something that you may want to look at.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Now, this topic here, the next finish syndrome.
Next finish. Something we've preached against for years on-prem. Now we have to go back out there and do the same for the cloud.
Yeah, and another little story here for you, Crystal, along the same lines of that customer that went and had the marketing department have the ability to go take and sign up for a subscription, go light up a website, and have the corporate presence running there. Did you know that, we can take and we can have other teams that potentially set up the tenants that we're handed? So I typically work in like a server operations team and the security team supporting Windows critical infrastructure. And so in multiple scenarios, we've had other teams that have gone and spun up tenants. And they're like, oh, I see a gallery item in here. It says Windows Server 2022. I can just pick that. I can install it. I can configure it. I can give access to it from the internet. I can do all of these things. The word of caution is be careful as to who you're giving admin rights inside of your tenant, but it can happen. And so the reason that Microsoft has actually partnered with the Center for Internet Security, and your little gold nugget here is if you don't know what the Center for Internet Security is, that's going to be one of your takeaways from this session. Go learn more about this, because what CIS provides us with, Crystal, is benchmarks, not just for Microsoft technologies, but for critical infrastructure, switches, firewalls, other operating systems. And it's a list of all of the settings required to lock down to a specific industry-driven standard. And so the minimum that I recommend for organizations today is that you should try to get yourself up to, at minimum, CIS benchmark level 1. It's minimally invasive. It is possible for you to do this. Yes, there's settings that you're going to have to tweak and tune along the way, but what it removes for you is the next finished syndrome. And so there's probably over 300 or 400 settings inside of there that get configured. And good news for us as IT pros, Crystal, it comes with all of the pre-configured group policies. And if you're working in an environment where you're securing desktops and you're not using group policies anymore because maybe you have modern desktops that are out there, they actually have all the settings for you for Microsoft Endpoint, so also known as Intune. So they have all the configurations that you need to make from an Intune perspective, and every single setting is documented for you. So you don't have to go build the 900-page guide describing why and how you've done this. And they have the same thing for Azure hardened images as well.
So what we're doing when we're just next finishing, we're just basically providing low-hanging fruit for threat actors to come after, right? So we need to really make sure we're paying attention and getting these things hardened. And honestly, you were talking about this the other day. We have a whole generation of new IT pros that have never, like for some of us who have been around, us old folks, as Dave likes to call us, we've been around, we've worked on this, we've learned how to install all these things on physical servers. So we have a whole generation of younger kids coming up that will never even put their hands on a physical server. They'll never do what we would call a traditional install. So this is a great way for them to go in, to learn, to figure out how to harden this stuff, things they haven't done in the traditional sense before, the harder way or the traditional way that we used to have to do it.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the things as well with this is not only that new generation coming up, but also a little bit of proof for our managers that are out there, because they always want to say, are we really secure? Because my buddy's a CEO at this other company, and he said that his company wasn't secure, and they didn't pass their audit. Are we going to be able to pass an audit? And so this is one of my favorite pieces, is that, the Center for Internet Security has also integrated compliancy scanning for the different levels of CIS benchmarks included in their Defender Advanced Threat Protection. And so we use that a lot with our customers to make sure that not only are you applying these templates, you're seeing how you're scorecarding in there as well to see just how well you are going to pass the audit. And you can find those machines that pop into the network that are maybe in the wrong organizational unit in Active Directory that didn't take those policies, or that people are trying to skirt around your policies. So CIS is a definite plus. Make sure that you're looking into this if you haven't already. All right. Speaking of audits, yes. Hybrid. Is hybrid dead, Crystal? on-prem infrastructure going away? Is this something that we're seeing in the world that we live in?
The thing is, Microsoft just created the new hybrid Azure MP category. I would say probably not. I think hybrid's around for a long time. I don't think we're ever going to, I won't say never, but no, I'm going to say never. I don't think we're ever going to go 100% cloud throughout the world. It's just not going to happen. I think hybrid is where a large portion of our organizations will be for a very long time.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the big benefits that you get from a cloud security and kind of recovery perspective and even backup perspective is the ability to take and start feeding and ingesting some of that information from our on-prem infrastructure into the cloud. And so one of the big issues that a lot of organizations still face is patching and management of infrastructure. And so Microsoft is doing a very good job of innovating inside of there with features like auto-manage, patch management capabilities, so that now you can load up those workloads and they're trying to become not victims of next finish. There's actually integration inside of there now for CIS benchmarking as well via Azure hybrid configurations via Azure Arc. And if you're not familiar with what Azure Arc is basically an extended bridge up into Azure, and it gives us the ability to have an agent on there, and then we can push command and control sets down from our Azure tenant into our hybrid infrastructure. Now, one of the most important pieces of that for me is the Security Center integration with those on-prem resources that you have. And so now, from within one single pane of glass, we can start to get a view of what's happening inside of our hybrid infrastructure. So hybrid is definitely a very big piece of this. You want to take and you want to make sure that you're looking at the innovations that your cloud providers are giving you from a hybrid perspective, because, you're not going to have all of your workloads and all of your infrastructure living in one place. It's not necessarily going to be all cloud, especially when you're talking with your backup vendors that are out there, like our great sponsor, Rubrik. What's the support capabilities for, on-prem and hybrid, right? On-prem and cloud, and inside of that hybrid world, can we take and can we manage all of that stuff? Oh, this is a great one, Crystal. Number 6. This is one that, it wouldn't be an end of 2022 webinar without, having some type of controversial type topics inside of here. And so what's this one?
So one thing in the conferences we've been at recently, I've noticed is that people don't ask questions of their providers. They just, the providers have these checklists and these benchmarks and all these things that they demand of you when you're coming in. But where is us putting them in the hot seat? Where is us putting some demands on them as to our security when we bring our information over to them? So a lot of people don't realize you can ask your providers to provide you security information as well. Like, what do they do in what is their protocols in the event of a breach or in the event of an attack? What is the onus on them? What is it that they handle, and what is it they expect you to handle?
Well, and it goes back to that point, operationalization of cloud infrastructure in the same way that we have spent years operationalizing our on-prem infrastructure. The traditional support teams that I normally deal with, Crystal, I will say that they are masters at their trade of operationalizing that internal infrastructure. There could be almost any scenario. We've got playbooks, we've got operational guides, we've got call down sheets, we've got escalation paths, we've got vendor support channels. We have all of those pieces that are set up for our on-prem infrastructure. But that big piece of, we haven't been hit yet. What happens if you are? And if you think that you're not going to be hit, that's not the right posture to take. You have to take the posture that an event will happen eventually, and are you prepared for it? And so, what happens, as you mentioned, in the event that the provider gets hit? And so the provider being hit we really can't do anything.
No.
So let's take that piece off the table. If the provider gets hit, there's a big one that just hit the news here this past week. Rackspace got hit. Rackspace is massive. And it took down a whole bunch of customers' hosted Exchange environments. And so what can you do in the event that something like that happens? Unfortunately, the answer is really nothing but wait, because you're not going to be able to phone 1-800 support saying, okay, I'm a tenant. I'm really important. When can you get me up? Can you get me up faster than somebody else? They're scrambling in the same way that we would be scrambling. So let's take that piece off the table.
So that does come back a little bit to our cross-cloud that we talked about earlier too, right? So if you are that client that needs to be up 24/7, 365, stuff like this does happen, and that is where you want to look at some of that cross-cloud replication. But that aside, what happens when you get hit? When your data in the cloud gets hit, what does your provider do, and what do they expect you to do?
Yeah, we call that an incident response plan, Crystal. And so the incident response plans have traditionally been built for, on-prem VR, on-prem infrastructure. And so that on-prem infrastructure that we have needs to be boiled up to the cloud as well. And so that's the big pieces that we have to look at here. You can work with your cloud providers, ask all of those tough questions, but then you also, if the onus is on you, tenant side, operationally speaking, to rebuild those operational procedures so that you can take and that you know exactly what to deal with. And for example, this is another really good little gold nugget for everyone. Don't store your emergency call down sheet in the cloud. Print it out on a piece of paper somewhere that you can find it.
Oh, for the love of Pete, update that thing regularly, please.
Absolutely. But there's certain things you still need on pen and paper, right? Because everybody's scrambling. Like, I know we had a provider for this. What's Dave and Crystal's cell phone numbers? How do we get in touch with them? You need to make sure that you have a copy of that, because we actually had a client that had all of that stuff stored, and it wasn't a cyber attack for them. It was actually an outage, but they had it all stored on their internal SharePoint site. Can't open it now. So it's another good piece of this, right? But make sure that you're out there and you're putting your providers in the hot seat, and make sure that you're out there asking those tough questions. All right. Now, building into that, recovery plans, Crystal. Is one recovery plan enough, or do you think that we need multiple recovery plans to handle different potential situations and scenarios?
Honestly, how does one plan for ransomware and cyber attacks in the cloud? Like, it's not the same. To a point, it's not the same as the traditional planning with your... What do we say when someone gets attacked? What is the first thing we want them to do?
I want them to unplug stuff.
Pull that plug.
Yep.
What do you do in the cloud? You don't have access to that plug.
Yeah, what if you're locked out of your accounts? What if part of that hack, that breach, was your break glass account? What if that was your global admin account? What if you're kind of locked out at that point in time? What if you can't even phone it into the vendor? Seconds count. There could be a lot of damage being done in there in the meantime. So one of the big pieces that we look at with those recovery plans is testing of the variety of scenarios, and also having plans to potentially being able to recover that infrastructure over to either another tenant, greenfield, whatever it is. If we're talking on-prem, what we would do in an on-prem consideration here is the fact that it's not just you being locked out by the bad guys. Is forensically speaking, your cyber insurance might actually demand that their teams of forensic experts be given access to everything while they're trying to figure out what's going on. And if you're not part of that process, technically you are locked out. You aren't allowed to touch anything inside of there. And I've seen that process take, in the terms of weeks. So in the meantime, what can we be doing as IT as part of that cyber recovery plan? I always recommend that you have a greenfield recovery plan available to you. Hopefully you've had some type of immutable backups available so that you can take and you can recover those somewhere else, so that at least you can get critical services and critical operations running For example, one of the biggest ones for organizations is getting the payroll team up and running, the accounts payable team, because people still need to get paychecks. So VFP still needs to come through so that we can pay. But you want to make sure that we're taking and that we're having those pieces available.
I'm honestly seeing some great DR plans and some very detailed what we're going to do, that greenfield scenario, everything. That is all great, but if you're not testing those DR plans, then they're relatively pointless. If you haven't tested, you can plan to as long as you want, but if you don't go through and actually run those tests, run those scenarios, check to see that what you planned is actually going to function in the case of an attack or any other kind of reason that you're taken down, you're not actually planning. You're planning to fail. Okay? If you're not testing, you're planning to fail. Absolutely. And the other thing is make sure you're building in red team and blue team exercises inside of there. So along that, you've got a breach in the cloud. Now what do? You can't really pull the plug. Is the business going to be able to take and revert back to manual process? Just understand this. Let's just throw some numbers at this. Hypothetically here, Crystal, you have 100 IaaS VMs that are running inside of your tenant that you've migrated up there. You've had some type of exploit that's got you. Those VMs are now either rendered unusable or they're off. They're in some really bad shape. You've tried to now recover them, but you just recover them and then they just get reinfected. What do you do at this point in time? So having the ability that we can either take and, like I said, have some type of immutable backup, maybe going back to a point prior to when we were attacked. Can we even do that? How much have you integrated your business practice? I know that we do a lot of work in the manufacturing sector. So, are those robotic cells that are running on the plant floors integrated with IoT infrastructure that's, relaying that information up to the cloud? Can that stuff run dark? Can you still keep that plant running? As John always says, can we make it so that, the staff and employees can still get paid while we're dealing with this, or are we legitimately sending everyone home? And so this one here is really key for me, is the fact that, pulling the plug is one thing, but does the business or does the leadership in your organization actually understand what's going on? So with your BCP plans, your business continuity planning that you're building, have you actually talked about this situation, the end of days type situation? Talk to businesses in Sweden right now today. Our good friend Sami Laiho is absolutely swamped right now with his organization because the level of cyber attacks are at an unprecedented level across government, healthcare, manufacturing, all sectors being hit. And so I think as a prudent piece of security and recovery coming into 2023, you need to add this into your executive level planning sessions as what type of infrastructure are we relying on and what happens if we do have to pull the plug? I think it's more than just planning on this side. I think training is a key factor as well. Your staff needs to know what to do if stuff goes down. Your staff needs to know where to go, if they're going to keep working, if they're going to, if like in some organizations, if stuff can't keep running when it goes down, then we're done. If they need to switch something over to manual, then they need to know they have to switch something over to manual. It's not just the higher ups, the higher levels that need to know what to do in the event of an incident or an outage. Your staff, all the way down to the lowest level of the organization, needs to know, what do I do if this happens? And a lot of people miss that step. I think they're not training the staff. The staff goes, okay, I can't log in. And now you've got 900 phone calls going to the IT center going, I can't log in. Did you try rebooting? Did you try doing this? Did you try doing that? Or, okay, everybody stop. Don't keep trying to log in. In the event of a ransomware, for example, you had that Monday morning scenario where all the printers start printing off. You've been ransomed. And everyone goes, oh, no. And what's the first thing they do? They all go try to log onto their machine and find out if they got hit too, if they still have access. And if you don't train your staff to go, don't do that, because in that particular incident, for example, as soon as you logged in, payload was delivered. If you don't train your staff not to, or what to do in the event of these scenarios, they're not going to know, and what could have been mitigated can end up being exponentially worse.
Oh, and we all have that user on the network that regardless of what the link is that's inside the email, you could be sending out test phishing campaigns and they fail every single time. And what's the ramifications for that? Well, hopefully it's not the owner of the company's nephew that's doing this, because there's not probably a whole lot that you're going to be able to do. But, make sure that you're taking and doing that. And that's a really good point. It's like the training of the users and driving it all the way down that far, because you don't have to go very far in the news to just see the fact that all of these companies get hit, right? And so, yeah, absolutely. And so a couple more things before we wrap up here, Crystal, is that we often get asked by the E-teams, the executive teams at organizations, for, we want to take and have it as part of our annual review that we're going to be having, audits. They're going to audit your financial statements. They're going to audit your processes. Maybe you've got some type of ISO certification that you have to go through. You have to get re-renewed for. Maybe you've got some type of other compliancy standard. Maybe you're in healthcare. Maybe you're in financial. Same goes for us from an IT perspective, from security. And so one of the big pieces here is that, this changes so fast that it's almost impossible to stay up to date on everything, right? And so we highly recommend that, coming especially into the new year here, that you're looking, if you're not doing it right now, external security audits. And by external, I mean an external organization coming in to help you, not just internal IT, because I often find with internal IT, there's stuff that's like swept under the rug.
Well, I meant to do that, or I'll get to that later.
Yeah, we don't need to talk about that. Let's just move on, right? And so the same thing for pen testing. Make sure that you're actually checking any of those artifacts that you've got that are out there externally representing your organization. In the case of that website, I'm going to throw up our corporate website on a cloud service with no protection. I guarantee you it's not going to be very long before that's either taken down or it's hacked, right? And so you need to make sure that you're checking this. Part of that process is going through what are called red team and blue team exercises, where we model and we test our defenses on the inside. So setting up threat protection is one thing. Testing it is absolutely another. And so that's one of the big pieces that we have, is that you've got to make sure that you go through and test this. John and I like to always talk about the cloud team exercise as well. Throw a cloud team in there as well, because your traditional red team and blue team might need a third one in there for a cloud team.
And I want to touch on this on one thing for you smaller organizations that are out there. We had a gentleman who came up, and honestly, I thought he was going to scream at us, and he did. He's like, "That's it. You have scared me so much. I'm going to run off and I'm going to quit IT and become a llama farmer." Do you remember that poor man?
Yeah.
He's, pardon me, he has a team of 2 for an entire university. He was struggling, and he goes, you've given me the foresight that I need help. And that's the thing, is you can only do so much within sometimes, and having the access to these external resources, you don't have to build everything within your team. You can go out and get a little bit of help on the security side. You can go out and leverage the people that are out there that are experts, so your IT team can focus on keeping the business running, and you can leverage some of these external resources in order to make sure that it's secure. That poor guy, he said his head was about to explode with all the stuff that he had to try and do now when he got home. And we just suggested, maybe you've got enough on your plate. Maybe some of these things are things you want to go to the experts for and get some outside help.
Awesome. All right. And the last tip that we've got for you for 2023 from Crystal and myself is go out there and get yourself some training. Crystal, there's an interesting statistic that just came up that we were talking about before the show.
I think it came out in Fortune magazine. 4.7 million IT people working in the IT security sector right now. but they're still showing a deficiency of 3.8 million, somewhere in those numbers.
And like 700,000 that are actively needed right now.
And honestly, Dave, I would wager out of those 4.7 million, how many of them were actually trained to security and how many of them were thrown into that fire because out of pure necessity?
Yeah.
Right? So training, it's never been a better time to go out and get trained in the IT security field.
For sure. And you know what? It's a great place to start as well. So if you're new in IT and you're looking at something for kind of like career advancement right now, IT security is hot. I always like to say, and I'll leave this and we'll kind of close off here, Crystal, with nobody gets fired today for spending too much money on security, and that includes people that you're going to bring into your IT security team. So even if you're in a sector of IT, and we've all probably been there, especially those of us that have been there for a while, we've had to reinvent ourselves over the years because that particular technology that we had is not really as important anymore. This is a really good way to reinvent yourself for 2023.
Especially if you like a career that's constantly moving, this is one thing where you never get to just kick back, relax, and rest on your laurels. It is an always changing, always exciting, and always challenging career field.
Absolutely. And so with that, I think we've covered most of the questions here going through. And with that, we'll hand it back over to John, and we'll go for a quick break before our next upcoming session. So on behalf of Crystal and myself, thank you, everyone. Have a happy holidays here, and we will see you in the new year.
Thanks, guys.